The contractions hit 3 minutes apart now, each one a fist squeezing low in her belly, and Sarah pressed her palm against the rough bark of a pine tree while the world tilted sideways. The bark scraped her skin raw. She could smell the sap bleeding from the tree, sweet and sharp like turpentine, mixing with the iron tang of blood that had been trickling down her inner thigh for the last half-mile. Somewhere ahead, through the blur of rain and exhaustion, she could see the stone markers of a pack border. Not her pack. She had no pack. She had nothing except the 2 heartbeats fluttering beneath her ribs like trapped birds. And those were fading. She did not know that the Alpha King of the Blackmere territory was standing 300 yards from that border, watching the tree line with amber eyes that had not blinked in 40 seconds. The rain was the cold kind, the late autumn kind that found every gap in clothing and turned fabric into a second skin. Sarah's dress had once been a hospital scrub top, pale green, stolen from the supply closet of the veterinary clinic where she had worked until 6 weeks ago. She had been the overnight custodian there, mopping kennels and sterilizing surgical trays between midnight and dawn, breathing in the smell of antiseptic and wet dog fur while the veterinarians slept in their warm beds. The clinic's owner, Dr. Hadley, had been the only human who ever spoke to her without looking through her first. But Dr. Hadley was dead now, heart attack at 63, and his son had sold the practice and told Sarah to clear out her locker by Friday. She had not mentioned the pregnancy. She had not mentioned anything. She had simply taken the scrub top because her other shirt had a rip from shoulder to waist, and she had walked out into a world that had never particularly wanted her in it. Another contraction. This one pulled a sound from her throat that she did not recognize, something animal and low. She gripped the tree harder, pine sap stuck to her fingers. The rain ran down her face and into her mouth, tasting like metal and dirt. She was 23 years old. She was 7 months pregnant with twins, and she had been walking for 4 days through territory that did not belong to anyone, the dead zone between the Ashford Pack lands and whatever lay to the north. She had heard the name Blackmere spoken in whispers at the Ashford compound, always with a specific kind of silence afterward, the way people go quiet after mentioning a storm that killed someone. The Ashford Pack had been her prison for 19 years. Her mother had died during childbirth, which the Ashford elders considered a curse. A wolf who could not survive the birth of her own pup was weak, they said, and weakness was hereditary. Sarah had been raised in the utility building behind the main hall, a concrete block structure that housed the water heaters and the emergency generator. She slept on a cot between 2 humming machines, and the vibration had become so familiar that she could not fall asleep without it. Even now, 4 days into the forest, she found herself pressing her ear against tree trunks, searching for a hum that was not there. She had never shifted. Not once. The pack healers said her wolf was dead, stillborn inside her the same way her mother had died bringing her into the world. They tested her at 13, the age when every Ashford pup first shifted under the full moon, and nothing happened. She stood in the clearing with 16 other teenagers, all of them trembling with anticipation. And she felt nothing. No pull, no heat, no wolf rising to meet the moonlight. Just the cold air on her bare arms and the sound of her own breathing while, one by one, the others transformed around her. The cracking of bones, the wet sound of skin splitting and reforming, the first howls, off-key and joyful, and Sarah, standing perfectly still, human-shaped and hollow. They called her the Empty One after that. She kept her head down. She learned to move through the compound like water, filling whatever space was needed and then evaporating. She cleaned the kitchens. She mended clothes. She organized the infirmary supplies with a precision that the pack doctor privately appreciated, but never publicly acknowledged. When the Alpha's son, Brennan, cornered her in the storage room 3 months ago, she did not fight. She could not fight. He was a shifted wolf in a man's body, 240 pounds of muscle and entitlement, and she was the empty one, the girl with no wolf, the custodian's orphan who slept with the water heaters. Brennan never spoke to her afterward. He passed her in the hallways as though the storage room had been a dream he had already forgotten. When her belly began to swell, the pack whispered about it, the way they whispered about everything, in the spaces between sentences, in the pauses between laughs. Brennan's mother, the Luna, had looked at Syrah exactly once, letting her gaze travel from Syrah's face to her stomach and back again, and then she had turned to her assistant and said, "Clear that cot out of the utility building. We need the space for the new generator parts." She had not said anything to Sarah directly. She did not need to. The message was in the absence, in the way Sarah's name disappeared from the kitchen rotation, in the way the infirmary door was locked when she tried to enter for her shift, in the way her cot appeared one morning on the front steps of the utility building, folded neatly, with her single change of clothes stacked on top. She left that night. No one followed. Now she was here, 4 days later, gripping a pine tree at the edge of Blackmere territory, and the contractions were wrong. Too early. Too strong. Too close together. The twins were not due for another 9 weeks, but twins in wolf pregnancies were unpredictable. Everyone knew that, and Sarah's body had been running on rainwater and the handful of wild onions she had dug from a creek bank 2 days ago. Her stomach had stopped growling yesterday. It had moved past hunger into a flat, aching silence, like a room after the last guest leaves. She took a step, then another. The stone border markers were carved with symbols she did not recognize, sharp, angular marks that looked like claw scratches rendered into language. The ground beneath her feet changed texture as she crossed, from the soft mulch of unclaimed forest to something harder, more packed, as though hundreds of feet had walked this path before her. The rain was letting up slightly. Through the thinning curtain of water, she could see the dark shapes of buildings in a valley below, smoke rising from chimneys, the warm amber glow of windows. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard and the world reassembled itself, but wrong, tilted about 15 degrees to the left. The next contraction hit, and she dropped to her knees on the packed earth. Her palms struck the ground. She could feel individual stones pressing into her skin, small and sharp, and she focused on that sensation because it was specific and real, and it kept the darkness at the edges of her vision from swallowing everything else. "Get up," she told herself. "Get up. The babies, get up." She got up. She made it 11 more steps before her legs quit. Not gradually, not with warning. One moment she was walking, and the next moment she was on the ground, cheek pressed against wet earth that smelled like iron and crushed pine needles, and the sky above her was the color of old pewter, and she could hear something that might have been footsteps, or might have been her own heartbeat, echoing strangely in her skull. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was a pair of boots, black leather, scarred across the toe, stopping 3 inches from her face. Then nothing. Kyle Blackmere had not slept in 31 hours, and the insomnia was not the problem. The problem was the border. 3 rogue wolves had been spotted in the northern dead zone over the past week, moving in patterns that suggested reconnaissance rather than migration, and his patrol captain, a stocky female wolf named Thera, had recommended doubling the sentries. Kyle had tripled them. He did not trust patterns that merely suggested. He was walking the eastern border himself that evening, because his wolf would not settle. The beast had been pacing inside him since dawn, restless in a way that had nothing to do with rogues or borders or the politics of territorial defense. It was a different kind of restlessness, one he had never felt before, like a compass needle spinning in search of a north that kept moving. The rain did not bother him. He was large enough that weather felt like a personal choice he had declined rather than a force being imposed on him. 6'4", 260 pounds, with the kind of shoulders that made door frames feel like suggestions. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. Water ran in channels down the scar that split his left eyebrow, a memento from the border war with the Grey Peak Pack 6 years ago when he was 22, and still learning that being an Alpha King meant being the first body between your people and whatever was trying to kill them. He governed 4,000 wolves across 7 settlements. He had killed in combat 14 times. He had held his dying father's hand, while the old king's wolf howled its last howl, a sound like a cello string snapping. He had done all of this before his 28th birthday, and none of it, not a single moment, had prepared him for what happened when the woman collapsed at his border. He smelled her before he saw her. The wind shifted, carrying rain and pine, and then, underneath those familiar notes, something else. Honey and wood smoke. That was the only way his brain could translate it. Honey that had been warmed over a fire until it darkened, and wood smoke from applewood. Not oak, not pine. Applewood specifically. The kind his mother used to burn in the kitchen hearth when he was small enough to sit on the counter and watch her cook. His wolf went absolutely still. Kyle stopped walking. His hand, which had been resting casually on the hilt of the knife at his belt, dropped to his side. His heartbeat, which had been steady and slow the way an alpha's heartbeat should always be, did something it had never done. It stuttered. Actually stuttered, like a skipped beat in a song, and for one disorienting second he felt his wolf and his human mind align with a precision that was almost painful, both of them pointing in exactly the same direction with exactly the same desperate clarity. Mate. The word did not arrive as language. It arrived as certainty, as gravity, as the sudden knowledge that the compass needle had found its north and it would never spin again. He moved toward the tree line. Not running. Running would have been undignified and also physically unnecessary, because his strides were long enough to cover ground at a pace most people had to jog to match. But there was an urgency in his movement that his patrol wolves noticed. 2 of them, flanking positions 20 yards to either side, turned their heads in unison. He saw her from 30 yards out, a shape on the ground, small, crumpled. The green of her clothing was barely distinguishable from the wet earth. For a terrible instant, he thought she was dead, and his wolf surged forward with such force that he felt his bones creak, his canines extending a 1/4 inch before he wrestled the shift back down. Then he was standing over her, and the scent hit him full force, no longer filtered through wind and rain, but rising directly from her skin, and it was not just honey and applewood smoke. There were other notes beneath those. Salt. Something green and growing, like the first shoot pushing through spring soil. And blood. Old blood and new blood, and beneath the blood, something fainter. Something that made his wolf whine in a register he had never heard from the beast before. She was pregnant. He crouched. His knees sank into the wet earth. She was lying on her side, one arm tucked beneath her head, the other curled protectively around her swollen belly. Her face was gaunt, the bones too visible beneath skin that was pale enough to be translucent. Her lips were cracked. There were circles under her eyes so dark they looked like bruises. Her hair, which was dark and matted with rain and dirt, clung to her neck in wet ropes. She was shaking. Even unconscious, her body was trembling with a fine, continuous vibration, like a wire pulled too tight. She was the most devastatingly important thing he had ever seen. "Who did this to you?" his wolf snarled, and the question was not metaphorical. The beast wanted a name, a face, a throat. Kyle pulled off his coat. It was a heavy black thing, oiled leather lined with wool, and it weighed enough that draping it over her felt like tucking a small tent around a sparrow. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her shoulders. She weighed nothing. That was the wrong thing to think, but it was true. A pregnant woman carrying twins should have been substantial, grounded, heavy with life. This woman felt like she was made of paper and prayer. He lifted her. She did not wake, but she turned her face into his chest, a small, unconscious movement, seeking warmth. Her forehead pressed against the place where his collarbones met, and the contact sent a current through him that felt nothing like electricity, and nothing like warmth, and everything like recognition. Every cell in his body rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. "My lord," one of his patrol wolves called, stepping forward. "She is." "She is mine," Kyle said. The words came out in a voice he did not entirely control, deeper than his normal register, rougher, the voice of the wolf speaking through the man. He did not shout. He did not need to. Every wolf within earshot went still, ears flattening, because when an alpha king claims his mate, the declaration carries a frequency that bypasses the ears and hits the hindbrain directly. He carried her down the hill toward the settlement. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing from the west, and the last light of the day came through the cloud break at a low angle, turning everything amber and gold. He walked steadily, not rushing, because rushing would jostle her. His strides were even. His arms didn't shake. He was aware of every breath she took, each one shallow and slightly ragged, and he counted them the way a man lost at sea counts the rhythm of waves. The settlement of Blackmere's central compound was not a compound at all, but a town, a real one, with cobblestone streets and timber-framed buildings and a market square where the vendors were packing up their stalls for the evening. People stopped what they were doing when they saw him. An alpha king walking through town carrying an unconscious woman was not a subtle image. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. He carried her past the market, past the council hall, past the training grounds where a group of young wolves had frozen mid-drill to stare. He carried her up the steps of the main house, a sprawling stone structure that had been the seat of Blackmere power for 9 generations. The front door was heavy oak, iron-banded, and his second-in-command, a lean wolf named Dorian, opened it from inside before Cale reached the top step. Dorian looked at the woman. Then he looked at Cale's face. Whatever he saw there made him step back without a word and hold the door wider. "Get the healer," Kyle said. "Now!" He carried her through the entrance hall, up the main staircase, and into his own quarters. Not a guest room. Not the infirmary. His room, where the fire was still burning from that morning, where the sheets on the massive 4-poster bed smelled like cedar and the soap he used, where no one but him had ever slept. He laid her down on the bed as though she were made of something that might shatter. He pulled the blankets over her. He brushed the wet hair from her face with fingers that had broken bones and signed death warrants, and were trembling now, visibly trembling, for the first time in his adult life. She opened her eyes. They were grey. Not the flat grey of overcast skies, but a luminous grey, like light through quartz, and when they focused on his face, He watched them cycle through emotions so fast, he could barely track them. Confusion. Fear. Something that might have been awe. And then, underneath all of those, a flicker of something else. Something her conscious mind hadn't caught up with yet. But her wolf, if she had a wolf, already knew. Her lips moved. The words came out as a whisper, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Where am I?" "Safe," he said. "You are safe." She stared at him. Her hand moved to her belly. "The babies," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the word. And the crack in her voice put a crack in something inside his chest that he hadn't known could break. "They are alive," he said, though he did not know this for certain. He could hear them, faintly, 2 rapid heartbeats layered over her slower one, and the sound of those heartbeats became immediately and irrevocably important to him, filed in the same category as his own breathing. The healer arrived. Her name was Maren, a grey-haired woman with hands that smelled like chamomile, and the calm, unsurprised demeanor of someone who had seen everything the world could do to a body and had decided to fix it anyway. She took one look at Sarah, and her calm did not waver, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Malnutrition," she said, pressing her fingers to Sarah's wrist. "Her pulse is thready, and the labor is premature. She needs fluids, calories, and warmth, in that order." "Then give her those things," Kyle said. "I need you to leave the room, my lord." "No." Maren looked at him. She had known him since he was born. She had set his broken arm when he was 9, and stitched the cut over his eye when he was 22, and told his father to eat more vegetables 2 weeks before the old king died. She did not flinch. "She is in labor," she said. "Preterm labor, with twins, in a body that has been starved for days. I can slow the contractions if her body allows it, but I need space to work, and I need her stress levels to drop. An alpha king looming over the bed with his wolf barely leashed is not conducive to either of those things." Kyle stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Sarah, who was watching this exchange with wide grey eyes, and he said, in a voice that was careful and controlled and cost him more effort than any battle he had ever fought, "I will be right outside the door. Right outside. You will hear my voice if you call." Sarah nodded. She did not know why his voice made the pain recede slightly, as though the sound of it was a hand pressing against the cramp in her abdomen. She did not know why his scent, which she could still smell on the coat wrapped around her, on the pillow beneath her head, made the shaking stop. Pine and steel and something underneath that. Something dark and sweet like burnt sugar, and her body was responding to it in ways her mind could not explain. Kyle left the room. He stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, and his eyes closed, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. Through the door he could hear Maren's voice, low and steady, and Sarah's breathing, and the 2 small heartbeats that had become the most important sound in his world. Dorian appeared at the end of the hallway. He had the good sense to approach slowly. "The border patrol found her tracks," he said quietly. "She came from the south, from the dead zone. From which pack?" Kyle opened his eyes. The amber in them was brighter than normal, almost luminous. Dorian had seen that glow before, usually in the moments before violence. "We do not know yet," Dorian said. "She has no pack scent, no markers. She is either rogue or she has been cast out long enough for the scent to fade. Find out." Dorian nodded and turned to leave. "Dorian," the second in command, stopped. "If someone did this to her," Kyle said, and his voice was very quiet, "I want a name. And I want them breathing when I get there." Dorian left without another word. He had served Kyle for 6 years. He knew the difference between a threat and a promise. This had been neither. It had been a weather forecast. Inside the room, Maren worked. She started an IV, threading the needle into a vein in Sarah's hand with practiced efficiency. Sarah winced but did not pull away. She had learned long ago that medical procedures went faster if you held still. "When did you last eat?" Maren asked, adjusting the drip. 2 days ago. Wild onions." Maren's expression did not change, but her hands moved faster. She mixed something in a cup, a thick broth that smelled like bone marrow and rosemary. "Drink this." Slowly. Sarah drank. The broth hit her empty stomach like a warm stone dropping into cold water, radiating heat outward. She closed her eyes. The contractions were still coming, but they had spaced out slightly, 6 minutes apart now instead of 3, and they were less sharp, more like waves than fists. "The man who brought me here," Sarah said. "The Alpha King." "Yes, he is the Alpha King." Maren glanced at her. "You did not know." Sarah shook her head. She had collapsed at a border in the dark and rain. She had not been aiming for Blackmere specifically. She had been aiming for anywhere that was not behind her. "He carried you himself," Maren said, and there was something in her voice that Sarah could not quite identify. Not surprise exactly, more like the verbal equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "He put you in his own bed. He has never let anyone into this room, not his advisors, not the cleaning staff. He launders his own sheets, which I find both endearing and slightly insane." Sarah did not know what to say to this. She was lying in the bed of the Alpha King of Blackmere, wearing a stolen veterinary scrub top, with pine sap still stuck to her fingers and blood drying on her thighs, and 2 babies trying to come 9 weeks early, and the broth was so good she wanted to cry. So she cried, quietly, with her face turned into the pillow that smelled like cedar and burnt sugar, while Maren pretended not to notice and adjusted the IV drip with the focused attention of a woman who understood that sometimes the best medicine was simply being present without commentary. The contractions stopped entirely around midnight. Maren confirmed it with careful examination, her hands gentle and warm against Syrah's abdomen. The babies had settled. Their heartbeats were stronger, steadier, fed by the fluids and calories flowing through the IV. Sarah's body, given the minimum requirements for survival, had apparently decided to cooperate. "They are fighters," Maren said. "Like their mother." Sarah almost corrected her. She was not a fighter. She was a custodian, a cleaner, a girl who slept between water heaters, but the words died in her throat because they were not entirely true anymore, were they? She had walked 4 days through wild territory while 7 months pregnant. She had dug onions from a creek bank with her bare hands. She had kept walking when her body told her to stop, and she had kept breathing when her lungs told her to quit. And she had crossed a border she did not know into a territory she had only heard whispered about. And she was still here. The babies were still here. Maybe she was a fighter. Maybe she had always been one, and the Ashford pack had simply never given her anything worth fighting for. She fell asleep with one hand on her belly and woke to grey morning light and the sound of someone breathing nearby. She turned her head. Kyle was sitting in a wooden chair beside the bed. He had changed clothes, a simple black shirt and dark trousers, and his hair was dry now, revealing that it was not pure black, but shot through with a single streak of dark silver at the left temple. He was asleep, but it was the sleep of a wolf, light and watchful, his body angled toward the door, as though, even unconscious, he was positioning himself between her and whatever might come through it. His face in sleep was different. The severity was still there, the strong jaw, the sharp planes of cheekbone, the scar bisecting his eyebrow, but the hardness was gone. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a single night, but the accumulated exhaustion of years of being the first and last line of defense for 4,000 lives. The lines at the corners of his eyes were not laugh lines. Sarah watched him breathe, in and out, steady and slow, his chest rising and falling with the patience of tide pools. She did not know this man. She did not know anything about him, except that he had picked her up off the ground and carried her somewhere warm and put her in his own bed and stood outside the door all night because his healer told him to. And he had listened. She did not know him, but something in her, something deeper than knowledge, something that lived in the same place where a wolf should have been, recognized him with a certainty that felt like muscle memory. His eyes opened. Not gradually, instantly. One moment asleep, the next awake, and his gaze found her face with the precision of someone who had known exactly where she was, even in sleep. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was lit by the grey light from the window and the faint orange glow from the hearth. Sarah could hear birds outside, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the ordinary sounds of a world continuing. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Better," she said. And it was true. He nodded. He was sitting very still, the way large predators sit when they are trying not to frighten smaller animals, and Sarah understood with a sudden clarity that he was afraid. Not of her. For her. Afraid of moving too fast, of speaking too loudly, of doing anything that might make her flinch. The Alpha King of Blackmere was sitting in a wooden chair in his own bedroom, afraid to scare the pregnant custodian sleeping in his bed. The absurdity of it made something in her chest loosen. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to not run, because Maren says you should not be on your feet for at least a week, and also because I would follow you anyway. So running would be both medically inadvisable and strategically pointless." Sarah blinked. Was that a joke? His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one haunting the corner of his lips. "You are my mate," he said, "my fated mate. I knew it the moment I smelled you at the border. My wolf knew it. Every cell in my body reorganized itself around you in the space of a single breath, and I have been sitting in this chair for 7 hours trying to figure out how to tell you that without sounding like a lunatic." Sarah stared at him. The words landed one at a time, each one a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward through her in concentric circles of disbelief. "That is not possible," she said. "I do not have a wolf. I am wolfless. I have been tested. I am the empty one." Something dangerous moved behind his eyes, not directed at her. She could tell the difference. She had spent her entire life reading micro-expressions for survival, cataloguing the specific tension in a jaw that meant anger, the particular flatness in an eye that meant cruelty. What she saw in his face now was not either of those things. It was fury held in absolute check, fury at whatever had taught her to call herself empty. "Who named you that?" he said. "Everyone," she said. He leaned forward. The chair creaked under his weight. He was close enough now that she could see the individual flecks of gold in his amber eyes, could see the faint network of old scars across his knuckles, could smell him, pine and steel and burnt sugar, and her body responded to his proximity, the way a compass responds to magnetic north. "I have been an alpha since I was 20, he said. "I have met 10,000 wolves. I have felt the mate bond described to me by my father, my mother, my advisors, my warriors, and every mated pair in this territory. I know what it feels like, and I am telling you, Sarah, that you are my mate. Whatever they told you about being empty is a lie. There is nothing empty about you." She had not told him her name. He seemed to realize this at the same moment she did. His brow furrowed slightly. "Maren," he said. "She checked your belongings for identification. There was nothing except a name stitched into the collar of your—" He paused. "Scrub top." Sarah almost laughed. Almost. The sound got halfway up her throat and turned into something else, something wet and complicated that she swallowed back down. "You are the Alpha King of Black Mare," she said. "I clean veterinary kennels. I own one shirt. I am carrying another man's children. I do not even have a wolf. This is not—" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "This is not a thing that happens." "It happened," he said simply. "You do not know anything about me. I know that you walked 4 days through rogue territory, while in premature labor, because wherever you came from was worse than dying in the woods. I know that you are brave enough to do that, and humble enough not to see it as bravery. I know that the first thing you asked about when you woke up was the babies, not yourself. And I know that my wolf, who has never been calm a day in his miserable existence, is currently lying down with his chin on his paws for the first time in 28 years, because you are in the room." Sarah said nothing. She was looking at his hands, which were resting on his knees. They were large hands, scarred and calloused, and they were perfectly still. No fidgeting, no clenching. He was offering her information and waiting for her to do with it whatever she chose. "The babies are not yours," she said, testing it. "They are now." She had not expected that. She had expected hesitation, qualification, the diplomatic language of a king weighing political implications. She had expected him to care. "The father," she began. "Is irrelevant," Kyle said, "unless he hurt you, in which case he is relevant in a very specific and time-limited way." Sarah closed her eyes. The warmth of the fire, the softness of the bed, the steady presence of this man who smelled like safety. It was all too much. She had spent her entire life in a concrete utility building, listening to the hum of water heaters. And now she was lying in sheets that smelled like cedar in a stone house with a fire. And an alpha king was sitting beside her, telling her that her babies were his. And the absurd thing, the truly absurd thing, was that some part of her believed him. Not her mind. Her mind was still cataloguing escape routes and calculating how far she could walk before the contractions started again. But something else, something below the mind, in the place where instinct lived, in the dark, warm space where her wolf should have been and wasn't. Something in that space was uncurling, slowly, like a fern in spring, like a hand that had been clenched for so long the fingers had forgotten they could open. "I need time," she said. He nodded. "You have it." He stood. He was enormous when he stood, blocking the window light, and she felt a reflexive flicker of the fear response she had developed around large men. But it faded almost immediately, replaced by something she could not name. A gravitational awareness, a sense that his size was not a threat, but a perimeter. "I will have food sent," he said, "and clothes. The room is yours for as long as you want it. I will sleep elsewhere." "Where?" He glanced at the hallway. "Dorian has a spare room. I will survive." She did not tell him to stay, but she also did not tell him to go. And when he left, pulling the door closed behind him with the careful quietness of a man handling glass, she pressed her face into the pillow that smelled like him and breathed, The days that followed moved in a rhythm Sarah had never experienced, a rhythm of being cared for. Maren came twice daily, morning and evening, to check her vitals and the baby's heartbeats. She brought meals personally for the first 3 days, until she was satisfied that Sarah was eating consistently, and then she delegated to the kitchen staff with a specific list of instructions: bone broth, roasted root vegetables, eggs from the settlement's chickens, scrambled soft with butter, fresh bread with honey. The honey was dark and smoky, produced by bees that pollinated the applewood groves on the eastern slope of the territory, and when Sarah tasted it, she felt a jolt of recognition she could not explain. Kyle came each morning, and each evening. He knocked first, always. He sat in the wooden chair. He brought her books from the house's library, a collection that spanned centuries and included everything from tactical warfare manuals to botanical illustrations to a deeply improbable romance novel about a selkie that he placed on the stack with a completely straight face. "You do not have to stay," she told him on the 3rd evening. "I know," he said. "You have a territory to run. I am running it. Dorian is excellent at the parts that require sitting in meetings. I am better at the parts that require hitting things." She looked at him. He was reading a report of some kind, a sheaf of papers covered in tight handwriting, and his brow was furrowed in concentration. The firelight caught the silver streak in his hair. He had a habit of rubbing his jaw when he was thinking, a rasping sound of fingertips against stubble, and she had begun to catalogue these habits the way she used to catalogue supply closet inventory, with the same methodical attention to detail. "Tell me about your pack," she said. "The Ashford pack." She had not told him the name before. She had not told him much of anything, deflecting his careful questions with the practiced evasiveness of someone who had learned that information was a weapon other people used against you. But it was the 3rd day, and she had slept in clean sheets and eaten warm food, and been examined by a healer who treated her body as though it mattered, and these things had created a small crack in the wall she kept around herself, small enough to let a sentence through. So she told him. Not everything. Not the storage room. Not Brennan. But the utility building. The water heaters. The testing ceremony at 13. The name they gave her. The way the Luna's gaze had travelled over her swelling stomach, like she was reading an eviction notice. Kyle listened. He did not interrupt. He did not move. But as she spoke, she watched the amber in his eyes intensify, degree by degree, until they were nearly luminous, and she understood that he was holding his wolf back the way a man holds a leash attached to something enormous and very, very angry. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The Ashford pack. Yes. Alpha Gideon Ashford. His son is Brennan. You know them. I know of them. Gideon petitioned for a trade alliance 2 years ago. I declined. My intelligence reports described his territory as..." He paused, choosing words. "Poorly managed. High attrition. Unusually low birth rates." Sarah said nothing. The low birth rates were not surprising. A pack that treated its weakest members as disposable was a pack that was slowly eating itself. Kyle set the report down. He looked at her directly. "I would like to do something about this," he said. "But I will not do anything without your permission." "Do something about what?" "About the people who made you sleep in a utility building for 19 years. Sarah's throat tightened. No one had ever asked her permission for anything. No one had ever suggested that her suffering was something that could be addressed rather than endured. "Not yet," she said. He nodded. "Not yet." He did not ask why. He did not push. He picked up the report and continued reading, and Sarah watched the firelight move across his face and thought that she was in very serious danger of falling in love with a man she had known for 72 hours. On the 5th day, she got out of bed. Maren had cleared her for short walks the day before, provided she stayed on the ground floor and did not exert herself. Sarah had never been good at not exerting herself. Stillness felt like vulnerability. Movement felt like survival. She put on the clothes that had appeared in the wardrobe. Simple things, soft leggings, a tunic-length sweater in dark green that accommodated her belly, wool socks, leather boots that fit perfectly, though she had no memory of anyone measuring her feet. She suspected Kale. She suspected Kale of everything, every quiet kindness, every perfectly timed meal, every fire that was always burning when she woke. She walked through the main house slowly, trailing her fingers along stone walls that were cool and slightly damp with the condensation of old buildings. The house was large but not ostentatious. The hallways were lit by iron sconces. The floors were hardwood, darkened with age, creaking in specific places that she began to memorize automatically. Third plank from the wall, just past the staircase landing. Threshold of the library door, the spot in front of the kitchen where the floor dipped slightly, worn down by generations of feet. The kitchen was warm and smelled like rising bread and the sharp sweetness of cinnamon. A woman was kneading dough at a long wooden table, her arms flour-dusted to the elbows. She looked up when Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Oh," she said. "You are the one." Sarah hesitated. The one. The woman smiled. She had a round face, laugh lines, and the kind of easy warmth that made Sarah instinctively cautious. In her experience, warmth was usually a performance. "The Alpha's mate," the woman said, punching the dough with casual violence. "The whole settlement knows. He carried you through the market square in front of 200 people. It was extremely dramatic. My daughter said he looked like he was carrying the Holy Grail, except the Holy Grail was a very tired woman in a scrub top." Sarah did not know what to do with this information. She stood in the doorway with her hands clasped over her belly, and the kitchen woman, whose name was Ida, took one look at her and said, "Sit down before you fall down. There is bread in 10 minutes." Sarah sat. The kitchen chair was wooden and worn smooth. Ida worked the dough in silence for a while, the rhythmic thump of it against the table oddly soothing. And then she said, without looking up, "He has not taken a mate before, you know. Not for lack of candidates. Half the unmated females in 3 territories have made the trip to Blackmere to present themselves. He turned them all away. Politely, but firmly. His wolf never reacted to any of them. Not once." The council was starting to make noises about a political match, an alliance marriage, something practical. He told them he would wait. They said for what? He said he would know when he found it. She shaped the dough into rounds and set them on a baking sheet. "And then he found you," she said, "on the ground, in the rain, at the edge of the territory, and he carried you home like you were the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life." The bread came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, and Ida tore off a piece and handed it to Sarah with a pat of butter, and Sarah ate it standing at the counter, because she had spent her whole life eating standing up, and some habits live in the body longer than they live in the mind. She was in the library that afternoon, sitting in a window seat with a botanical illustration book open on her lap, when the door opened and a woman walked in who was not Maren, and was not Ida, and was not anyone Sarah had met. The woman was tall and immaculately dressed in tailored black, with auburn hair pulled back in a sleek arrangement, and features that were beautiful in the specific way of someone who had been told they were beautiful every day of their life, and had incorporated it into their bone structure. She smelled like jasmine and cold iron. She stopped in the center of the library and looked at Sarah, the way an art collector looks at a painting that has been hung in the wrong room. "So," the woman said, "you are the one who has turned the Alpha King into a lovesick nursemaid." Sarah closed the book. She did not stand. Something in her, some new thing that had been growing since she crossed the border, told her that standing would be a concession she did not need to make. "I do not know your name," Sarah said. "Vessa," the woman said. "Blackmere Council, Senior Advisor. I have known Cale since we were children. I helped him rebuild this territory after the Grey Peak War. I have been at his side for 6 years." The implication was clear. Sarah heard it. She also heard what was underneath it, the specific frequency of someone who had expected to be chosen and had not been. "And now," Vessa said. She crossed her arms. "Now he brings home a wolfless, pregnant stray from an enemy territory and puts her in his bed and tells the council that she is his fated mate. You will understand my concern." Sarah looked at her. She thought about the utility building. She thought about the testing ceremony. She thought about 19 years of being looked through. "Your concern is noted," Sarah said. Vessa's eyes narrowed. She had expected either fear or aggression, the two responses she was equipped to handle. Calm acknowledgement was neither. "You carry another man's pups," Vessa said. "Do you understand what that means for his bloodline, for the succession? The Blackmere throne has been held by a single unbroken line for 9 generations. If he claims you, if he takes your children as his own, he ends that line. He did not seem bothered by that. He is not thinking clearly. The mate bond impairs judgment. It is a biological imperative, not a rational decision. In 6 months, when the bond settles and reality sets in, he will have a wolfless queen and another alpha's offspring as heirs, and the council will." She stopped. Something had changed in Sarah's face. Vessa could not identify what it was exactly, but the woman sitting in the window seat was looking at her with an expression that did not belong on the face of a starving stray. "I understand your position," Sarah said quietly. "You have dedicated yours to this territory and to Kyle. You are afraid that I am a threat to everything you have built. That is reasonable. I would be concerned too." Vessa blinked. "But I did not ask for this," Sarah continued. "I did not aim for this border. I did not plan to collapse at the feet of an Alpha King. I was trying to survive, and I ended up here, and the man who found me has told me that I am his mate, and I do not fully understand what that means yet. But I know enough to know that it is not my job to manage your feelings about it. If you have concerns about the succession, take them to Kyle. He is the king. I am a woman with 2 babies who is trying to figure out how to eat 3 meals a day without crying." The silence in the library was the loudest sound Sarah had ever heard. Vessa looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind her eyes. A recalculation. The rapid adjustment of someone realizing they had misjudged the weight class of their opponent. And then, so briefly that Sarah almost missed it, something else. A flicker. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition of one woman who had fought for everything she had, looking at another woman who had done the same. "You are not what I expected," Vessa said. "I rarely am," Sarah said, and she did not know where the words came from, but they felt true. Vessa turned and left. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floor with the precise rhythm of a metronome, and Sarah listened to the sound recede and then sat in the silence that followed, and her hands were shaking, and she was breathing hard, and she felt, for the first time in her life, like someone who had stood her ground. That night, Kyle came to the room and sat in his chair, and Sarah said, "Tell me about Vesa." He looked at her. "She came to see you." She did. He was quiet. Then he said, "Vesa is the most competent administrator I have ever known. She rebuilt our trade network after the Grey Peak War. She designed the patrol rotation system that has kept our borders secure for 4 years. She is brilliant and loyal, and she has been in love with me since we were 16. Sarah said nothing. "I have never loved her back," he said. "Not in that way. I told her this when I was 20, and she presented herself as a mate candidate. I told her clearly and directly, and without cruelty, and she accepted it, and she chose to stay and serve the territory anyway, and I have respected her for that every day since. But I will not apologize for what I feel for you in order to make her comfortable. That would be dishonest, and Vesa deserves better than dishonesty. She thinks the mate bond impairs judgment." "It does," he said. "It absolutely does. I have not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since you arrived, because every time I close my eyes, my wolf wants to come in here and lie at the foot of your bed like a dog. I reorganized my entire schedule so that my morning meeting ends before you usually wake up. I had Ida make applewood honey specifically because my wolf informed me, in no uncertain terms, that you needed it. I am impaired. Thoroughly. Completely. And I would not undo it if I could." Sarah looked at him across the firelight. He was being honest. She could smell honesty on him the way she could smell the cedar in the sheets, layered and specific and impossible to fake. She held out her hand. He looked at it. Then he looked at her face. Then he reached out and took it, his fingers closing around hers, and the contact was a circuit completing, a key turning, a note finding its harmony. His hand was warm and rough, and it engulfed hers completely, and she felt the tremor that went through him, the full-body shudder of a man who has been holding himself in check with absolute discipline and is being undone by the simplest possible touch. They sat like that, hand in hand, while the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, and neither of them spoke because the silence was saying everything. The first sign that something was wrong came 10 days after Sarah's arrival. Dorian brought the intelligence report at dawn, his face carrying the particular grim set that Sarah had learned meant bad news presented in bullet points. She was in the kitchen with Ida, learning how to braid bread dough, her flour-dusted fingers working the soft strands, while Ida corrected her technique with the patient bluntness of a woman who had been braiding bread for 40 years. Kyle appeared in the kitchen doorway with the report in his hand and a look on his face that made Ida quietly stop talking and find somewhere else to be. "The Ashford pack has filed a retrieval claim," Kyle said. Sarah's hands stopped moving. The bread dough sat on the counter, half braided, going tacky in the warm air. "A retrieval claim," she repeated. "Under the Interpack Accord, a Pack Alpha can petition for the return of a member who has fled to another territory. It is an old law, rarely invoked. It requires proof of membership and a formal hearing before the Regional Council. I am not a member of the Ashford Pack. They cast me out. They did not formally exile you. There was no decree, no public declaration. They simply made your life unlivable until you left, which is, from a legal standpoint, not the same thing." Sarah felt the old familiar chill, the one that started at the base of her spine and climbed upward, the body's ancient response to being trapped. She had felt it in the utility building on the nights when the generator hummed louder than usual and the walls seemed to shrink. She had felt it in the storage room. She had felt it for 4 days in the forest, walking toward a border she could not see. "What does Brennan want?" she said. She did not say, "the father of the babies." She did not say his name with any particular inflection. But Cale heard it anyway, heard the shape of the fear inside the flatness of the question, and the amber in his eyes flared. "The claim was filed by Alpha Gideon," Kyle said. "Brennan's father. The stated reason is that you are carrying offspring of the Ashford bloodline, and that the pack has a rightful claim to the children." The bread dough was drying under her fingers. She pressed it, felt it resist, and thought about how her life had been a series of moments where she pressed against something and it refused to give. "They do not want me," she said. "They want the babies." Kyle set the report on the counter. He placed his hands flat on either side of it, and his knuckles were white. "They will not have them," he said. "They will not have you. They will not set foot in this territory. But I need you to understand that the Regional Council takes retrieval claims seriously, and Gideon Ashford is not stupid. He will frame this as a matter of bloodline rights, and there are members of the Council who will be sympathetic to that argument. What can I do?" "You can tell me everything," he said. "Everything you have not told me. Everything about why you left. Because if this goes to a hearing, I need to know what they did, and I need to be able to prove it." Sarah looked at the half-braided bread. The strands were uneven, amateur work, but recognizably bread. She had made it with her own hands in a warm kitchen while someone taught her how. She told him about Brennan. She told him about the storage room, the concrete floor, the metal shelf that dug into her back, the sound of the generator humming through the wall. She told him in a flat, precise voice, the voice of someone describing events that happened to a body she had since left. And she watched Kyle's face while she spoke, watched the muscles in his jaw work, watched his eyes go from amber to something closer to molten gold, watched his wolf press so hard against his skin that she could see the veins in his neck darken, and his fingertips split at the cuticles where claws were trying to emerge. He did not shift. He did not break anything. He stood perfectly still, and he listened to every word. And when she finished, the silence in the kitchen was thick enough to taste, metallic and charged like the air before a lightning strike. "I will kill him," Kyle said. And it was not a promise or a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone he might use to report the weather or the time of day. Sarah shook her head. "Not like that. Not because of me." He looked at her. His eyes were not human anymore. They were pure wolf, pure predator, and yet the expression in them was one of such precise, devastating tenderness that she felt her chest crack open along a fault line she had not known existed. "Then because of the law," he said, "assault on a packless wolf is a violation of the accord. Assault resulting in pregnancy without consent is grounds for immediate forfeiture of rank. If Gideon files this retrieval claim, he opens his pack to investigation. And if an investigation reveals what Brennan did, and I will make certain that it does, then Gideon does not lose a claim. He loses everything." The hearing was set for 21 days later. In that time, Sarah learned several things. She learned that Blackmare was not like Ashford, the way a river is not like a drainage ditch. The wolves here moved differently. They looked at each other. They argued in the council hall with passion and volume, and then drank together afterward. The children ran in packs through the market square, and no one was sleeping in utility buildings. And when Sarah walked through the settlement, people nodded at her. Not with deference, not yet, but with the simple acknowledgement of her existence, which was more than she had received in 19 years at Ashford. She learned that Cale's wolf was named Fenris, and that Fenris was notorious among the Blackmare wolves for being essentially ungovernable. Other alphas commanded their wolves. Kyle negotiated with his. The beast had once torn through the wall of the council chamber during a particularly heated debate about fishing rights, and Kyle had spent 3 days repairing the masonry himself as a public apology. She learned that the one thing that made Fenris calm was her. This was not poetic. It was observable. When she was in the room, Kyle's posture changed. The perpetual tension in his shoulders released by degrees. His breathing slowed. The amber in his eyes settled into a warm, steady glow, rather than the volatile flare that his wolves associated with imminent violence. Dorian mentioned it to her once, quietly, while Kale was across the room reviewing patrol maps. "I have served him for 6 years," Dorian said. "I have never seen him sit with both shoulders below his ears. You are doing something to him that 6 years of loyalty and competence could not accomplish. I would be offended if it were not so obviously good for him." She also learned, gradually and with increasing alarm, that something was happening inside her body that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. It started as warmth. Not the external warmth of the fire or the bed or Kale's proximity, but an internal warmth deep in her chest, in the space behind her sternum. She felt it first on the 12th day, while she was in the garden behind the main house, pulling weeds from the herb beds, because Maren had mentioned needing fresh rosemary, and Sarah was constitutionally incapable of hearing about a need without filling it. The warmth pulsed once, like a second heartbeat, and then it was gone. She stopped, one hand full of weeds, the other pressed to her chest. The sensation had lasted less than a second, but it left an afterimage, a ghost heat that lingered the way sunlight lingers on closed eyelids. It happened again that night, stronger, and again the next morning, while she was eating breakfast. Each time, the warmth lasted longer and reached further, spreading from her chest into her limbs, into her fingertips, into the soles of her feet. It felt like being filled with something, slowly and carefully, the way you fill a vessel that has been empty so long you are not sure it can hold anything without cracking. She said nothing to Kale. She said nothing to Maren. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt the warmth pulse, and tried not to think about the Ashford healers who had tested her at 13 and declared her empty. Maybe they had been wrong, or maybe what they had called empty was actually dormant, a wolf sleeping so deeply that no moon could reach it, waiting for something else, something specific. The day before the hearing, Sarah woke to a sound she had never heard before. It was coming from inside her, not from the babies, whose heartbeats she had learned to feel as a doubled rhythm low in her belly. This was different. This was a sound that vibrated in her bones, a low harmonic that traveled through her skeleton like a tuning fork struck against stone. She sat up in bed. The dawn light was blue-gray. The fire was out. Kyle was not in the chair. He had left for an early meeting with his legal advisors. She was alone, and the sound was getting louder, and the warmth in her chest was not pulsing anymore. It was continuous. It was building. She pressed both hands to her sternum and felt her skin hot to the touch, as though she had a fever concentrated in a single point. The heat spread, down her arms, into her palms. Her fingers tingled, and then went numb, and then came alive again with a sensitivity so acute she could feel the individual threads of the bedsheet beneath her fingertips. And then something opened. It was not like the shifting she had witnessed at 13, the cracking bones and splitting skin. It was nothing like that. It was silent and total, a door opening in a room she had been told did not exist, and behind the door was light, white gold and ancient, and within the light was a presence that was not human and not wolf and was somehow both and neither. The presence looked at her with eyes that were her own eyes. "Oh," Sarah breathed. "There you are." The wolf inside her was not a wolf. Not exactly. It was something older. Something from before the bloodlines split and categorized themselves into alpha and beta and omega. It was the thing that had been dreaming in the dark behind her breastbone for 23 years, fed by nothing, sustained by nothing, waiting with a patience that was geological. It was a white wolf. She knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, without evidence, without explanation, the knowledge simply arriving fully formed like a word she had always known, but never spoken aloud. The white wolves had been gone from the world for 300 years. They were not alphas. They were not omegas. They existed outside the hierarchy entirely, which was why the Ashford healers had found nothing when they tested her. They had been looking for a wolf that fit their categories. What lived inside Sarah didn't fit any category. It simply was. The room filled with light. Not visible light, not the kind that burned retinas or cast shadows. A different kind, the kind that the wolves of Blackmare felt in their bones, that made them stop what they were doing and look toward the main house with expressions of confused reverence, that made Fenris surge inside Cale so hard that the Alpha King gasped in the middle of a sentence and gripped the edge of the council table and said, "Sarah." He was running before anyone could respond, down the hallway, up the stairs, through the door of his room, and she was sitting in the bed with her hands pressed to her chest, and her eyes wide, and the air around her shimmering with something that looked like heat distortion, but felt like dawn. The light faded when she saw him. It pulled back into her, retreating to the space behind her sternum, and the warmth settled to a steady glow, and Sarah looked at Cale with eyes that were no longer grey. They were silver, pure silver, reflective as mercury, and when he looked into them, he saw his own face reflected back, and he saw Fenris reflected back, and he saw both of them recognized and known. "What?" he said, and his voice was rough. "What just happened?" "I found my wolf," she said. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and knelt beside the bed, and she put her hands on either side of his face, and the contact sent a shock wave through both of them that was not pain and not pleasure, but a third thing, a completion, a frequency that had been searching for its match for a very long time. "You," he said. He pressed his forehead against hers. His breath was warm against her lips. "You are not empty. You are never empty." "Sarah." "You are, I know," she said. "I know." He kissed her, not gently, not carefully. He kissed her with the desperation of a man who had been holding himself at arm's length for 2 weeks because he was terrified of scaring her and could not do it for 1 more second. His mouth was warm and his hands were in her hair, and his wolf and her wolf recognized each other across the spaces between species and soul, and the kiss tasted like applewood honey and burnt sugar, and 23 years of waiting. She pulled back first. Not far. Her hands were still on his face. His eyes were still inches from hers. "The hearing is tomorrow," she said. "Yes, I'm going, yes. And Brennan will be there." His jaw tightened under her palms. "Yes." "Good," she said, and she meant it. The hearing took place in the Regional Council Hall, a vast stone building on neutral ground between territories, 2 hours' drive from Blackmare. The interior smelled like old wood polish and the accumulated tensions of centuries of interpack disputes. The benches were hard oak. The ceiling was high enough to echo. Sarah walked in, wearing a dress that Ida had made in 3 days, deep blue wool with silver thread at the cuffs, and her hair was clean and braided, and her eyes were silver, and every wolf in the hall felt the ancient frequency of what she was and did not know how to name it. Kyle walked beside her. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His presence was a wall, a declaration, a gravitational field that bent the attention of every person in the room. On the other side of the hall, Alpha Gideon Ashford sat with his legal advisors and his son. Gideon was a big man gone soft, the kind of alpha who had been formidable once and was now formidable mainly by reputation and inertia. His hair was steel grey. His eyes were calculating. He looked at Sarah with the expression of a man looking at livestock that had wandered off the farm. Brennan sat behind his father. He was handsome in a careless, unconstructed way, blonde hair, easy smile, the kind of face that got away with things. He did not look at Sarah. He looked at his phone. The council head, a weathered female alpha named Reva, called the hearing to order. Gideon's legal advisor presented the retrieval claim in formal language, citing bloodline rights, pack membership precedent, and the Interpack Accord's provisions regarding offspring born to pack members in foreign territories. The argument was clean and practiced and completely hollow, and Sarah sat in the front row with her hands folded over her belly and listened to a room full of powerful wolves discuss her children as though they were assets on a balance sheet. Kyle's legal team responded. They presented evidence of Sarah's de facto expulsion from Ashford territory, including testimony from 3 former Ashford wolves who had separately left the pack over the past 5 years and were willing to describe the conditions. They presented Marin's medical report, documenting Sarah's state upon arrival, the malnutrition, the premature labor, the evidence of chronic neglect. And then Kyle stood. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of politeness or protocol, but the biological quiet of smaller predators in the presence of a larger one. Kyle was not the most politically powerful alpha in the region, but he was the most physically dangerous, and everyone in the room knew it, and his wolf was very close to the surface. "I have additional evidence to present," he said, "regarding the circumstances of the conception of these children." Gideon's composure shifted. A small movement, barely perceptible, the tightening of fingers on the arm of his chair. Brennan looked up from his phone. Kyle didn't look at Brennan. He looked at Reva, and he spoke in a voice that was controlled and measured and carried to every corner of the hall. He presented the facts. He presented them without embellishment, without emotional language, without the theatrical fury that his wolf was howling for inside his chest. He stated what had happened to Sarah in the storage room of the Ashford compound. He stated the date. He stated the time. He stated that Brennan had used his physical advantage and his hierarchical authority to assault a packless, wolfless woman who had no recourse and no protection. The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. Brennan was on his feet. His face was red. "That is a lie," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, and the crack told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. Gideon did not move. He sat in his chair and looked at his son, and for a moment, one single moment that Sarah almost missed, his face showed something that was not political calculation or alpha authority, or the reflexive protectiveness of a father. It was recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has always known what his son is, and has spent years building walls around that knowledge, and is watching those walls come down in public. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Then his face closed again, smooth and hard as polished stone, and he said, "These are unsubstantiated accusations." Reva looked at him. Then she looked at Brennan, who was standing with his fists clenched and his face mottled and his wolf barely leashed. Then she looked at Sarah. "Will you speak?" she said. Sarah stood, Her legs were steady. The warmth in her chest was steady. The twins were steady, 2 heartbeats ticking in perfect synchrony beneath her ribs. She spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She described the storage room, the concrete floor, the metal shelf, the sound of the generator. She described these things with the precise, detailed recall of someone who had catalogued every sensory detail of the worst moments of her life, because that was how her mind worked, filing and organizing and storing, and the details were so specific and so consistent that no one in the room doubted her. When she finished, Brennan was sitting down again. His face was no longer red. It was white. He was looking at his hands. Raver called for a recess. During the recess, Gideon Ashford requested a private meeting with the council. During the private meeting, he withdrew the retrieval claim. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge what had been said about his son. He simply withdrew the claim. And then he stood, and he looked at Sarah across the hall, and she looked back, and their eyes met, and something passed between them that was not forgiveness, and not reconciliation, but a mutual understanding that certain things had been said that could not be unsaid, and the world was different now. Gideon walked out. Brennan followed. At the door, Brennan paused. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking back, and Sarah saw his mouth move. She could not hear the words, but she read his lips. She had spent her life reading the subtleties of people who did not speak to her directly. I am sorry. She did not know if she believed him. She did not know if it mattered. What mattered was that he had said it to the doorframe of a council hall while walking away, which meant he was not sorry enough to face her, but sorry enough that the words had to go somewhere. And that was a complicated, unsatisfying, human thing. They drove back to Blackmare in the late afternoon light. Kyle drove. Sarah sat in the passenger seat with her hands on her belly, feeling the twins kick, watching the landscape scroll past, the dense forest giving way to the rolling hills of Blackmare territory, and the golden autumn light made everything look like it had been painted by someone who believed in happy endings. Kyle reached across the center console and took her hand. He did not say anything. He drove one-handed through his territory, with his mate's fingers interlaced with his, and Fenris was so quiet inside him that Kyle checked twice to make sure the wolf was still there. That night, in his room, which had become their room without either of them formally acknowledging the transition, Sarah stood by the window and looked out at the settlement below. Lights in windows, smoke from chimneys, the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle, badly, with more enthusiasm than skill. Kyle came up behind her. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat of him along her back, and he waited. She leaned back. Her shoulders met his chest. His arms came around her, settling beneath her belly, holding the weight that she had been carrying alone. She felt his chin rest on the top of her head. She felt his heartbeat against her spine, slow and steady, a rhythm that her own heart was beginning to match. "I want to stay," she said. "I know," he said, "not because of the mate bond, not because I have nowhere else to go, because this feels like the first place I have ever been where people can see me without me having to be invisible first." His arms tightened. Not painfully, protectively, the way you hold something precious when you are standing in wind. "I want to claim you," he said, formally, publicly, in front of the pack. "I want every wolf in this territory, and every wolf outside it, to know that you are mine, and I am yours, and those children are ours. I want it with a possessiveness that should embarrass me, but does not. But I will not do it without your yes. I will not take from you what was taken before. You choose. You always choose." Sarah turned in his arms. She looked up at him, His face was very close. She could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes, the scar through his eyebrow, the silver streak at his temple. She could see the vulnerability that lived underneath the authority, the specific loneliness of being the strongest person in every room and having no one to be weak with. "Yes," she said. His wolf surged. She felt it through the bond, which was wide open now, a channel between them that carried not just emotion, but sensation, and she felt Fenris's joy as a physical thing, a pressure in her chest, a vibration in her bones. He kissed her forehead, then her temple, then the corner of her mouth, then her mouth, slow and thorough, and the kiss tasted like burnt sugar and belonging. The claiming ceremony took place 3 days later. The entire settlement gathered in the central square, 4,000 wolves arranged in a semicircle around the ancient stone dais that had served as the site of Blackmere ceremonies for 9 generations. Torches burned in iron brackets. The air smelled like pine smoke and cold earth, and the concentrated anticipation of a community witnessing something sacred. Sarah stood on the dais in a white dress that Ida had made from fabric that had been Kyle's mother's. The fabric was old, but not fragile. Heavy silk with a pattern woven into it that only showed in certain light. Wolves running in an endless circle, nose to tail. Her hair was loose. Her eyes were silver. Kyle stood facing her. He was in black, as always, but formal, a fitted jacket with the Blackmere crest at the shoulder, a silver clasp at the throat. His hair was combed, his jaw was clean. He looked like a king, which he was, and also like a man who was about to get everything he had ever wanted, which he was. Maren stood as witness. Dorian stood as witness. Ida stood in the crowd with tears running freely down her round face and made no attempt to hide them. Vesa stood at the edge of the square, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, and when Sarah's eyes found her in the crowd, Vesa gave a single nod. Not warm, not cold, acknowledging. Kyle spoke the old words, the claiming words that had been spoken on that dais for 300 years, the formal declaration of mate, of bond, of the joining of 2 wolves into one unit that could not be separated by law or war or time. He spoke them in the old language first, then in the common tongue, and his voice carried over the crowd without amplification, the way an alpha's voice was designed to. And then Sarah spoke. She was not required to. The traditional ceremony required only the alpha's declaration. The mate's role was to accept, to tilt her head and bare her neck and receive the marking bite. But Sarah was not traditional. She was a white wolf, the first in 3 centuries, and she had spent 23 years silent, and she was done. "I choose you," she said, and her voice, which had always been quiet, carried over the crowd with a resonance that did not come from volume. It came from the thing inside her, the ancient wolf, the white light, and when she spoke, every wolf in the square felt it in the place where their own wolves lived, not as command, not as authority, as truth. "I choose this territory, and these people, and this life. I choose you, Kyle Blackmere, not because the bond told me to, but because you sat in a wooden chair for 7 hours, trying to figure out how to tell me you were my mate without scaring me. Because you laundered your own sheets. Because you put me in your bed and slept in Dorian's spare room without being asked. Because when I told you the worst thing that ever happened to me, you did not look at me like I was broken. You looked at me like you wanted to find the person who did it and end them. And then you asked my permission first. I choose you because you are the first person who ever gave me a choice." The silence after her words was not empty. It was full, saturated with something that 4,000 wolves could feel but not name, a collective exhalation, a shift in the emotional weather of the territory. Kyle stepped forward. His hands cupped her face. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones. "May I?" he said. She tilted her head. Not in submission, in invitation. She bared her neck to him, and the gesture was not about vulnerability. It was about trust, the most powerful thing one person can offer another. He lowered his mouth to the junction of her neck and shoulder. She felt his breath first, warm and unsteady, the breath of a man holding himself together by force of will. Then his teeth, sharp and precise, and the bite was a bright point of pain that immediately bloomed into something else, something warm and deep and permanent, a bond that wrote itself into her biology, the way a river writes itself into stone. Fenris howled, not through Kyle's throat, but through the bond, and the sound was felt rather than heard, a vibration that travelled through every wolf in the square and called their wolves to respond. They howled back, 4,000 voices raised to the night sky, and the sound was not pretty. It was raw and ragged and layered with harmonics that made the torchlight flicker. Sarah's wolf answered. The white light flared behind her sternum and pushed outward, and for a single heartbeat, she glowed. Not dramatically, not like a special effect, but softly, steadily, the way a candle glows in a dark room, and the wolves closest to the dais saw it and went quiet with a reverence that had nothing to do with hierarchy and everything to do with awe. The glow faded. The howling faded. Kyle lifted his head. There was blood on his lips, Sarah's blood, and she reached up and wiped it away with her thumb. And the intimacy of that gesture, domestic and tender in the middle of a ceremony, made something in the crowd shift. She was not performing royalty. She was being herself, and herself was a woman who wiped blood off her mate's face with the same unself-conscious practicality she brought to weeding herb gardens and braiding bread dough. "They're going to be fine," Ida said to the woman standing next to her. "They're going to be just fine." The twins came 5 weeks later. It was early morning, the thin blue light before dawn, and Sarah woke to a contraction that was different from the false alarms she had been having for weeks. This one was low and certain, a wave with intention behind it. Kyle felt it through the bond before she spoke. He was awake and on his feet and calling for Maren before Sarah had finished saying the word now. The labor lasted 14 hours. Maren attended. Kyle stayed. He held her hand through every contraction, and she crushed his fingers with a grip that would have broken a human man's bones. And he didn't flinch. Not once, because the pain in his hand was nothing compared to the pain moving through the bond and the overwhelming terror of being helpless while the person who mattered most did something he couldn't do for her. The first twin was born as the sun came up. A girl. She came out screaming, her voice enormous for something so small, her fists clenched, her eyes squeezed shut. Maren laid her on Sarah's chest, and the baby's screaming stopped the instant she felt her mother's skin. She opened her eyes. They were amber. The second twin came 20 minutes later. A boy. He was quieter, more observational, born with his eyes open and his head turned as though he was already looking for something specific. His eyes were silver. Kyle looked at his children. His children, not by blood, by choice, by the bond. By the moment in the kitchen when Sarah had said the babies are not yours, and he had said they are now, and meant it with every molecule of his being. He looked at them, one in each of Sarah's arms, and Fenris did something that the wolf had never done before. Not howled, not growled, not paced. He lay down. He lay down inside Kyle's chest and put his head on his paws and closed his eyes and was still. "What are their names?" Maren asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. Sarah looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at Sarah. "The girl," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from 14 hours of labor, "is Maren. If that is all right." Maren the healer went very still. Then she said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Well, she will certainly have strong lungs." She pressed her knuckles against her mouth briefly, a private gesture, and then she was brisk again, checking vitals, adjusting blankets. "You should not have done that," she said. "It is an absurd name for a baby. She will hate it by the time she is 12. She was smiling so hard her cheeks ached. "And the boy," Kyle said. He reached out and touched his son's face, one fingertip against a cheek the size of a plum. The boy grabbed his finger. The grip was surprisingly strong. Kyle felt something fundamental rearrange itself inside his chest. A tectonic shift, plates of identity sliding into new positions. He was a king. He was a mate. And now he was a father. And all three of those things existed simultaneously, without contradicting each other. "Rowan," Sarah said. "For the trees." "For the trees," Cale repeated. He liked it. It was solid and growing and rooted. The room smelled like blood and sweat and clean linen, and the warm milk smell of newborns. And the fire was burning, and the dawn light was coming through the window in long gold bars, and Sarah's white wolf hummed softly in her chest, a lullaby that the babies heard through the bond, and that Kyle heard through the bond, and that Maren, who had no bond to either of them, heard anyway, because some sounds transcend the mechanisms of hearing and arrive directly in the heart. Sarah lay in the bed that smelled like cedar and burnt sugar, her mate beside her, her children in her arms, her wolf awake and singing inside her, and she did not think about the utility building or the concrete floor or the humming generator. She did not think about the testing ceremony or the name they gave her or the 19 years of being invisible. She thought about bread, about Ida's hands in flour, shaping dough, about the way the kitchen smelled when the oven was warm, about the first time she ate the applewood honey and felt something she could not name, about the fact that she was going to teach her daughter and her son to braid bread, the way Ida had taught her, standing at a wooden counter in a warm kitchen in a territory where people could see each other. Kyle pressed his lips to her temple. She felt his breath in her hair, warm and steady, the breath of a man who was not going anywhere. The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The babies slept. The wolves in the settlement below were waking, and the smell of bread was beginning to rise from Ida's kitchen, yeast and flour, and the particular patience of dough that has been given time to become what it was always meant to be,